I am Lori Murray, President of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board. No one could have predicted this confluence of events just a few months ago, beginning with the COVID-19 pandemic, the ensuing economic crisis, then the death of George Floyd, followed by the seismic street protests driving a sea change in public consciousness. CEOs across the American landscape have added their voices to the discussions and are determined to use their influence to make lasting change. For over 100 years, the Conference Board has helped the world's leading companies and society at large navigate crises and develop reasoned solutions in our nation's interest. Founded amid the labor unrest in 1916, the Conference Board led the adoption of workplace safety reforms, compulsory health insurance, and the 8-hour workday. We were at the forefront of the conversations regarding opening the workplace to women, people of color, and people with disabilities. Our policy center, the Committee for Economic Development, which I lead, helped shape the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II, as well as the Job Act of 1946, which set forth workplace reforms. That tradition today continues with our efforts to shape public policy that impacts our workplace, communities, and government. Given recent events, the Conference Board is launching a series of CEO forums to foster action called Building a More Civil and Just Society. And today we have the privilege and pleasure of interviewing Gerald Chertavian, who is the founder and CEO of Year Up. Gerald is dedicated to closing the opportunity divide that exists in our nation. Determined to make this vision a reality, he combined his entrepreneurial skills and his passion for working with young adults to found Year Up in 2000. Year Up is one of the fastest growing nonprofits in the nation. It has been recognized by Fast Company and the Monitor Group as one of the top 25 organizations using business excellence to engineer social change. Gerald has been committed to working with underserved young adults for more than 3 decades. He's actively participated in the Big Brother mentoring program since 1985 and was recognized as one of New York's outstanding Big Brothers in 1989. Gerald began his career as on Wall Street as an officer of the Chemical Banking Corporation. Following graduate school, he co-founded Conduit Communications and fostered its growth to more than $20 million in annual revenue. From 1993 to 1998, Conduit ranked as one of the United Kingdom's fastest growing companies. Following the sale of Conduit to iCube in 1999, Gerald turned his full attention to creating opportunities for others. Gerald, thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to start, given your experience, to get your perspective on where you see how you see the country is today in terms of civil unrest and societal change. Do you think this is a moment for lasting positive change for the United States?
First of all, Laurie, thanks for having me. Pleasure. When I think about where we are right now as a country, prior to COVID-19, the level of economic inequality in our country was already significant. You just think about out of the G7 countries, we have the highest Gini coefficient, or the highest level of income inequality. So we kind of pre-COVID-19, we came into this already with a high level of economic inequality, which had been exacerbated for those at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. You say, well, how is that, what does that look like? If you just kind of look at the statistics, 20% of the people lost their jobs in March of those who are employed in this country. Yet 40% of the people who are in a household that makes below $40,000 per year lost their jobs or were furloughed in March. So you had a disproportionate impact that said the economic inequality we had prior actually got significantly worse as a result of COVID. So disproportionately hitting those at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So when you talk about the state of our country, inequality was bad prior to this virus, and it's actually got significantly worse. You then look at post the killing of George Floyd in the movement that's been started to address systemic racism, to start to look much more carefully at police brutality. The reality is, if you say, is this now a moment for real change? I think it is. I mean, I think that this, for a lot of reasons, why is this moment important? I think a few things come to mind. The first is the demographics will continue to change in this country so that we have increasing percentage of our population who are Black and brown. So the voice, the numbers of our population increasingly will grow as we get on this path. I think also just the ability to have capture and dissemination of events, of instances which highlight racial injustice, which highlight brutality against people of color, has only and will only continue to increase. So we have changing demographics, we have an increased ability to, I'd say, capture and therefore disseminate what's happening. And I think that's contributed to changing public sentiment, not only public sentiment, but corporate sentiment as well. And it'll be down to our leadership, both at our corporate level significantly and certainly our government level, as to whether this is a moment or a movement, right? Is this truly a tipping point or not? We have clearly in the past experienced types of increases in consciousness that has perhaps led folks to say we are going to change. But I do think this has the potential to be more than a moment for this country, and indeed a movement for this country. And it'll take the leadership of our corporate sector significantly for that to happen.
So, Gerald, as you mentioned, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the economy, on unemployment, and has widened the divide in terms of inequality. So what do you think needs to be done? And you had mentioned that it's both corporate and government, and how do they need to do it?
But I think there's three things one could think about. I mean, at the end of the day, education is really our most critical opportunity. If we're going to close the opportunity divide that currently contributes so much to the inequality we see, at first we have to start to ensure that all of our citizens, all of our children are getting a quality education. In the most recent research out of Stanford, Sean Reardon, Professor Reardon has led this, has shown that the achievement gap has actually been more related to poverty than race. So then segregation, which correlates by race to poverty, obviously then has disproportionate effects on communities of color, because communities of color tend to be in high poverty schools. But I think we have to recognize this isn't a child problem, right? This is a systems problem, right? Our high poverty schools, our high poverty areas get less resources in education and less experienced teachers. So if we start out saying education is critical, and we systemically know that we have consistently underestimated the impacts of poverty on educational achievement, and if poverty is correlated to race, without fixing that system, we will not attack one of the fundamental things we need to do to close the opportunity divide, which is actually ensure that all children have a high quality education and access to the opportunities that they need to develop. So I'd say if you were to wave one magic wand, clearly education is going to be critical. So I take that as K-12 education. But I think that the second piece of this puzzle is what I call education to employment. Right? How does one go from their educational career to their economic career? And we've had a pretty monolithic system in this country that has said if you don't go to four-year college, you've somehow lost the game. And that was drummed into our citizenry, I'd say, for decades. The reality is school, post-secondary four-year college, is out of the price range of the majority of folks today in this country. And the majority of people in this country have to work while they go to school as well. So we have to go from that monolithic concept of what post-secondary education looks like to the multiple pathways that will be required to help people go from education into economic activity. So it's kind of fundamentally rethinking of that system of how do employers hire, where do they look for talent, what types of talent are they looking for, and are they operationalizing strategies to hire folks prior to a BA, kind of pre-baccalaureate hiring strategies much more significantly. So helping people get into that labor market is critical. Even if you look at the work LinkedIn has done to show that where you grow up, what school you go to, and what company you work for, collectively can give you a 12 times advantage on accessing opportunities, right? So just the network gap that exists to connect to employment. I mean, 70% of people got their job because they knew someone in the company that they're working in currently. So when you have networks that are very disparately accessed by certain groups, in addition to not having the ability to get the education you need from an economic point of view, we've got to fix that system from education to economic activity. And then the last piece, I would argue that corporations have a significant opportunity to influence is it's not just about hiring people of color. It's about helping them to develop and advance within companies to ensure they get mentoring, coaching, and real sponsorship to advance within those companies. And in fact, many of the executives of color that I speak with would say, Gerald, getting hired was the easiest part. Advancing, developing, progressing was actually much more difficult. So I think then the practices that companies employ to not just recruit and hire, but to retain, advance, and develop from underserved communities, both racial and socioeconomic, is another system that we need to improve if we're to get the types of economic mobility we need and want that ultimately impact that next generation most significantly as to how do the children of those individuals grow up and to what opportunities do they have access.
So Gerald, you've played a really prominent role as founder and CEO of Year Up in addressing this issue and trying to bridge the opportunity divide. How have you been doing that more specifically? And also, how have the challenges of COVID's devastating attack on the employment in this country affected the work you're doing and how you're looking forward and to continue to improve the success rate of students in the workplace?
Well, we've been fortunate at Year Up over the past 20 years to serve 30,000 low-income young adults. And in 1 year, what we provide to those young adults is a true opportunity to go from either low wage or no wage to a livable wage job with some of the very best companies in this country. And so what we've been able to prove is this is, one, it's very possible. And in fact, the federal government had done a 7-year randomized controlled trial on Year Up and several other called anti-poverty programs, and came back to us and said that Year Up has raised wages for low-income individuals more than any other program in the nation's history. So those were in our words, that's the federal government through 7 years of randomized controlled trial. So I think the real question is, how do you take a very successful anecdote, and if you look at the scale of the problem, 30,000 is an anecdote compared to the millions of young people who need opportunity. How do you go from being a very successful anecdote to being a sustainable, scalable answer that becomes more systemic? So how can we imagine a world where companies would say, of course, we have operationalized a pre-baccalaureate hiring strategy. Of course, we look at those not just from a few schools. Of course, we understand that hiring folks from community colleges and from certificate programs and certification programs in enabling them to continue their education when they get to our company is the way we do business, that whole upskilling process. So Europe's embarked on a number of efforts with some of the company's really largest and most important employers to say, how do you take this to a more scalable answer? And Europe has never been proprietary in its approach. We see this as a systemic need, and therefore trying to get that what we know works for 30,000, and we happen to be the largest at doing this. But how do you get it to become the new normal, so that all young people have a true opportunity to get into a livable wage career and to gain access to economic mobility? Look, COVID obviously affects our business significantly. We place folks into work-based experiences that then can turn into full-time jobs. So that's going to impact us. But the picture changed, honestly, between March, April, May, and June, July. So early on, it was a lot of folks were starting to pump their brakes in terms of how many folks they may need to hire. And frankly, post George Floyd's killing, we've had many folks reach out to us and say, you know what, we'd like to think more carefully with you about how we include you as part of our hiring strategy overall. So it had a significant impact. All of our students are studying virtually. They actually responded well to that, better than, once again, our students proved to us how resilient they are. So they've accommodated what is a shift to a virtual environment. It's not easy. It takes money, it takes thoughtfulness, it takes different pedagogy, but it's certainly possible. And then as companies think about how do they start to hire greater diversity within their ranks, there's been a recent significant shift in folks interested to understand how better to work with organizations like Europe.
So you've been an agent for change your entire professional life. And what would you say were some of the defining experiences that you had? Clearly your role as a big brother was part of that, and maybe an important part of that. But looking back, what were some of the major turning points in your life where you decided that you had mentioned how corporations and governments need to work on this issue, but you are an individual who really took up the mantle and decided to make a difference? What were some of the defining moments in your life that led you to this decision?
Larry, I had people often say, "Who's your greatest teacher?" My greatest teacher happened to be a 10-year-old boy from the Dominican Republic. And David Heredia has been my little brother. He's now not little, he's in his 40s now. But I got to privilege to spend time with back in the late 80s in New York City, and spending every Saturday of my life with David. And then over the years where we had an opportunity to have him live with our family, I started to learn about the opportunity divide in a very visceral way. And what I learned is that the bank balance of your parents, the zip code you grew up in, the school system you attended, and the color of your skin were determining the opportunities to which you had access much more than your God-given ability. And so that struck me as so inherently wrong, as against this country's fundamental ideals, that I said, there's got to be a way to make a difference in this. There's got to be a way to get in the way, as the late John Lewis used to say. And so started to write about that and think about that in the late 80s, and then wrote my essays to get into graduate school about starting effectively Year Up, and then was fortunate enough to get out of the for-profit world in a way that I could take care of myself and my family, and then dedicate all of my time to trying to take an idea and turn it into an organization. And now, Europe's a $160 million organization with 800 odd staff, and been for years and years showing, we get to look any 18-year-old in the eye and say, if you work really hard for 1 year and you play by kind of the rules, so to speak, we're going to support you, but you're going to end up with a job that pays on average $40,000 per year in a company like Bank of America or Salesforce or Microsoft or JP Morgan. And then you can start your career to advance in those organizations. That's a great, blessed position to be in, to be able to say that to young people across this country.
Well, Gerald, thank you so much for joining us. This has really been a privilege to hear not only your perspective, but also in terms of what's happening in the country and the role of Europe, but also your personal perspective as well. And really appreciate that. And thank you for being part of this series where we're hoping to make real change based on really fundamental, solid advice. And thank you for being a part of that.
No, it's kind of
Thank you.
a pleasure being here, Lori. Thanks so much.
And thank you for all you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. We're fortunate to do it.
Take care.